So this is how Matthew's Gospel opens. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and so on. So our premise for this series through November is looking at the 4 women who are mentioned in there. Now, if you're not familiar with Old Testament names, it might not be immediately obvious which the women are. So I'm just going to point them out to you. Tamar, in the 4th line. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, by Tamar. That's the story we're going to look at today, and it's a very interesting one. And then a little bit further towards the end of that first section, Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Sounds a bit like we're talking about racehorses, doesn't it? And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And then the very beginning of the next section, David was the father of Solomon by, interestingly not named, the wife of Uriah. And we're going to look through, her name was Bathsheba, by the way. One thing that Me Too has taught us is to actually name the women, isn't it? We're going to look through those 4 women and why on earth they're mentioned in this otherwise really rather... It's really interesting, isn't it? Because we look at the beginning of Matthew and we all skip over that first chapter because it looks so boring. It's very clearly set up to establish an impeccable lineage for Jesus. And you can see the way Matthew sets it out. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, 14 from the exile to the Messiah. And Matthew ends by pointing that out. 7 in the Hebrew Bible is very often a symbol of perfection. So you've got double perfection 3 times here. It's meant to be hugely symbolic. And if you look at the very end of Matthew's Gospel ends with the great commandment that Jesus gives to everyone: go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them everything I've taught you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. It's really clear, and we don't very often look at the whole sweep of it, but it's clear that Matthew is deliberately setting up his whole gospel in the context of the whole broad sweep of history. This is the whole of recorded history, coming from, Abraham, the first sort of named patriarch, really, all the way down to now, to Jesus' birth. And then at the end of the gospel, he says, we've heard about these kind of 30 years. Now he's with us always to the end of the age. And he frames this moment in time in the whole broad sweep of history. But the women that he names in this genealogy cut across any sort of sense that might set up for us of a great unrolling divine plan. Their stories are really messy, disruptive ones. They're full of pain and violence and trickery and the abuse of power, full of treachery. They are there, I think, to say we're looking at the whole of history, but this isn't a simple unrolling. It's not like God's rolling out a red carpet down the aisle and saying, here we are, it was all straightforward, it was all in my plan, I knew what was happening all along. These women show that it's a lot more complicated than that. And the first one we're looking at today, the first woman named in this genealogy, is Tamar. And without her, there wouldn't be a genealogy at all. She had to really work hard to have these children that are mentioned. So to give her story some context, women in this society, it's one of those stories that really shows just how alien this society was in many ways from ours. Women were almost valueless if they didn't produce children. It was considered a curse. And particularly if you hadn't got sons, you were valueless, you were on the scrap heap. And so there was an expectation that a husband had a kind of a duty to give women children and sons if he possibly could. And so a ruling that if a woman died childless, having been married, it was the deceased husband's brother's duty to try and impregnate her to give her children. It's quite hard. I mean, it's a really alien concept for us, but that was the context. And in this story, the brother selfishly refuses to do so. He chooses to use the withdrawal method of contraception because he doesn't want to have children that aren't his. He dies, and at that point, of course, she's been associated with two brothers who have then died, and the father-in-law decides that she's bad luck, she's some kind of taboo, and he's not going to marry her to his third son because he might die as well. So he leaves her. But Tamar refuses to be left without children, and so she decides to take the law into her own hands. So this is Tamar's story. This is in Genesis 38. I'm going to read the whole story because it's a good one. So if you're sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named her him Ur. Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. Judah took a wife for Ur, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Ur, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in to his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. She's been banished back home. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. And when Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." But he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you can come into me?" He answered, "I'll send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, what pledge do you want?" So she replied, "Your signet and your cord and that staff that's in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, taking off her veil and putting on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the kid by his friend to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute that was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said there hasn't been a prostitute there." So Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we'll be laughed at. I sent this kid and you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Let her be brought out and let her be burnt." As she was being brought out, she sent words to her father-in-law. "It was the owner of these that made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb, and while she was in labour, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez, and afterwards his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. This is a story that Matthew thinks, in telling us who Jesus is, it is absolutely imperative that we remember. Isn't that fascinating? I think the first point to note, particularly in our current context, is the simple one that women can be trusted and their version of their sexual history is worth hearing and is to be respected. It's the only example I can think of in any ancient literature, let alone the Bible, where the idea of a woman having sex is conceptualised as her taking what's hers by right. That's quite a common way for men to think about sex. Very unusual for it to be there as something that a woman is quite right and is vindicated in the story for doing. Notice that her father-in-law completely vindicates her once he realises the situation. I also want to point out onanism. Have anyone heard the phrase onanism? It's been used through a lot of Christian history, either to criticise the practice of masturbation or to criticise the practice of withdrawal on the basis that it's wasteful to waste this precious seed. Neither of those, let's be quite clear, are the point of that bit of the story. Onan's crime is selfishness. It's his own selfish devotion to his concept of a nuclear family that's his crime, rather than giving Tamar what should be rightfully hers. I said it's quite an alien culture for us to read into. It's nothing to do with his general sexual practices, and certainly nothing to do with conception generally. It's a very specific case where his selfish desire to protect his own vision of his nuclear family that he wants, focusing on his own lineage, prevents him from acting generously to someone in need. And then again, that little drama at the end about Perez and Zerah is one of the very, very few descriptions of actual childbirth in the Bible or in any ancient literature. And again, it complicates the genealogical patriarchal narrative that we're given here. It's not clear which of these are the firstborn. And notice, in the genealogy, both Perez and Zerah are noted. That's the only example where both children are noted in here, not just the one who becomes the direct ancestor. What I love about this story is that Tamar's plan is completely audacious. It's not just in our culture that this was a scandalous story. It was a totally scandalous story in her own culture, as you can tell by the fact that when they find out she's pregnant, their instinct is to burn her. It's not just an audacious plan, though. She executes it completely calmly and with total attention to detail. And without it, the lineage that Matthew so carefully draws for us wouldn't exist. She had to really fight to have those children, for this whole lineage to exist. And her example is the first suggestion in this lineage that the story Matthew's about to tell us of Jesus' birth, life and death isn't simply another hero narrative. Ancient literature was full of hero narratives. Here is this incredible, miraculous man who comes and saves everybody. That's a standard story. It's a standard story in most films and things nowadays, isn't it? And it almost always began, when you think of any of the Greek literature or anything else, it almost always began with a miraculous kind of birth. A miraculous salvation early on. This person nearly didn't come to exist, but here they are, and now they can save the world. So far, this is absolutely standard. Think of Moses being drawn out of the bulrushes, for another example, or all those Greek heroes who were only conceived because a god came down to earth in some extraordinary form. But this isn't that sort of narrative. It's not that kind of hero that Matthew's presenting. And I think the inclusion of these really complicated stories of women in the genealogy is a sign to us. And although it seems to us quite an obscure sign, I think in the context of the time it would have been a pretty blaring, flashing light that this is not that simple. And the inclusion of these women sets up, I think, some of the themes in Matthew's Gospel. So, for example, it's a really strong theme in Matthew's Gospel that sometimes those entrusted with carrying out the law can't be trusted to work in the interests of those with less power. And that's a really important theme in Tamar's story. She was relying on her father-in-law to ensure that the right thing happened. It didn't, so she had to take the law into her own hands. Similarly, there's a theme that sometimes it's only those who've been thrust to the margins of society by powerful dynastic interests who'll take up the baton of God's work in human history. And they might need to do this by scandalous or even unconventional means. We see that obviously in Tamar's story. We see it in the story that Matthew's about to tell of Jesus. Jesus' death wasn't what everyone was expecting from the coming Messiah. With this kind of setup, this kind of genealogy, if you don't notice the women, you're expecting a military conqueror, a Hollywood hero, a sort of great and powerful king who will, in capital letters, make Israel great again. That's what people were expecting. But here in the very first lines of the Gospel, Matthew subverts all that setting up of a new kingly dynasty stuff by saying it's really not that simple, and you're going to have to look at the edges. You're going to have to look at the margins. You're going to have to look at those people who took the law into their hands, who did things that were scandalous and audacious and outrageous to make sense of this story. So I just want you, in a few moments, to turn to each other and to think about two questions, if you would. You can pick either question or you can look at both. The first is, what other gospel themes do you see prefigured or hinted at in the inclusion of Tamar's story? What other things that Matthew says about Jesus do you think he might be hinting at by including this reference to Tamar here? And secondly, and perhaps more obviously, what relevance, if any, might this story have for discussion of sexual ethics today? So over to you. Suggest you get into maybe 3s or 4s.